So thank you all for coming. Our guest needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway, just for the sake of it. So Steven Pinker is an experimental psychologist and one of the world's foremost writers on language, mind, and human nature. Currently, Johnston Family Professor of Psychology here at Harvard. Pinker is also taught at Stanford and MIT. His research on vision, language, and social relations has won prizes from the National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Institution of Great Britain, the Cognitive Neuroscience Society, and the American Psychological Association. He has also received 8 honorary doctorates, several teaching awards at MIT and Harvard, and numerous prizes for his books, The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, The Blank Slate, and The Better Angels of Our Nature. He's chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary and often writes for the New York Times, Time, and other publications. He's been named Humanist of the Year, Prospect Magazine's The World's Top 100 Public Intellectuals, Foreign Policy's 100 Global Thinkers, and Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People in the World Today. And I should also say that I've already told Professor Pinker this. This is the only book about writing that I allow in the Writing Center. And it's really well written, which is sort of a miracle for a book about writing. So I'm so grateful that you're here and very excited. And I have some questions from students, but first let's start just in a more basic way and just talk about why we should care about good writing.
The first question
Yeah.
one should ask,
Yes.
and a way in which I begin the book. I list 3. One of them is to achieve clarity. The point of writing is to get ideas across. That can be done better or worse. You can torture your readers trying with the challenge of trying to decipher what on earth you're trying to say. That is inconsiderate, to put it mildly. It, for those of us in academia whose work often is reviewed by journal reviewers, grant reviewers, and so on, it puts them in a bad mood if they have to read every one of your sentences 3 or 4 times to try to figure out what you're talking about. And of course, it betrays our calling as scholars to spread ideas if our readers don't know what we're talking about. So just raw clarity. And ambiguity, we might get to this later, but those of you who've read either the Boston Globe or the New York Times in the last week may have seen the article called, in one version, For Want of a Comma, about a multi-million-dollar lawsuit filed against a Maine dairy that all hinged on the placement of a comma. That would be an example of clarity. Second is to earn trust. If your prose is well crafted, and that's something that anyone can see, it instills a bit of confidence that you have taken care in all those bits that they can't see, such as the quality of your research or the quality of your data, your veracity in citing sources. Again, to pick a concrete example, we have all received, been targets of phishing scams, phishing with a PH, where we're overhauling our customer database and we need you to re-enter your password. So if that message purporting to be from Chase Manhattan Bank is filled with spelling and punctuation errors, that's kind of a giveaway that this may be some Romanian teenager. But it now doesn't mean that if it is properly punctuated, spelled, and it's grammatical, that it is legitimate. I certainly don't want to convey that impression. But that kind of check against of integrity is another reason why it's worth paying attention to the quality of your prose. You really do trust someone, deservedly or not, if you see that they've taken the care to write meticulously. And the third is that it adds beauty to the world. For those of us who enjoy reading, a well-crafted sentence is a well-crafted prose passage is one of life's great pleasures. And why not make the world a more enjoyable place by writing prose that will be pleasant for your readers to experience? So those are the three reasons.
Your understanding of the care that is necessary for writing reminds me of what Wittgenstein says about the philosopher, that the philosopher is the one who takes time. And I wonder if the good writer is also the one who takes time.
Yeah, it's not a foolproof guide, because there can be kind of academic kind of scam artists, I say, you might even think of it, who put so much attention into their prose that it makes up for sloppiness in scholarship. So you could be a victim of that. But in general, you'd expect an overall sense of meticulous responsibility to spread itself both in the crafting of the prose, which you can see, and the underlying research, which you cannot see.
Right.
So at least it's a heuristic. If someone is sloppy in the way they put a sentence together, it kind of conveys the impression they may not be so trustworthy in their in everything else.
It's signaling.
It's signaling, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's signaling.
I want to call attention to a passage early in this book and talk a little bit about it, particularly with relevance to the writing-related concerns of graduate students. You say the starting point for becoming a good writer is to be a good reader. Writers acquire their technique by spotting, savoring, and reverse engineering examples of good prose. What are some examples of prose that have proved to be formative in your own intellectual life? Do you have some sort of regular standards to which you return, who always prove to be a source of inspiration, or are you continually looking for new ones?
I'm continually looking for new ones, but I think I was fortunate to be in a field in my own discipline, psychology, where a lot of great psychologists were also really good writers. I don't know if this is true of all academic fields, but some of the real luminaries, including many of the ones at Harvard, were great stylists, beginning, I suppose, with the namesake of the building in which I work, William James Hall. I mean, William James was one of the... Stunning, one of the great writers of the English language in any field. He was the, I guess, what do they say, that William was the, William and Henry, of course, were brothers. William was the psychologist who wrote like a novelist, and Henry was the novelist who wrote like a psychologist.
Exactly.
But anyway, William James, always amusing, witty, entertaining, often hilarious. So William James, one of my two advisors, the late Roger Brown, who founded the study of language development in children, but he himself was a wonderful prose stylist. George Miller, are any of you psychologists? I don't think so. But yes? Oh, of course. But one of the great psychologists of the 20th century, George Miller, and a founder of the fields of cognitive psychology and psycholinguistics, was a brilliant writer. B.F. Skinner, even though I'm not a Skinnerian behaviorist, but he actually began as a novelist and had several bestsellers in addition to his scholarly work. So anyway, as an undergraduate, I think it served two purposes. One, it was just an example of how prose can be written, scientific prose, in a lively, witty, engaging style, but also and I think this is critical, it just planted the message that you don't have to be a bad writer to succeed in academia. And this is I think, a misunderstanding. At least, who knows? I don't know every field in academia. Maybe there's some fields where you have to write badly to be taken seriously. This is not true of psychology, and it's not true of a lot of fields. Biology, economics, I think often graduate students come in with a little bit of fear, oh gee, if I write too clearly, maybe people will think I'm not profound enough or sophisticated enough. And that is not true, certainly not in psychology. Other examples, Harry Harlow, Stanley Schachter, Leon Festinger, a lot of the big names were, Gordon Allport, were superb writers.
What about even before that, as a child or a teenager? Did you have writers who were sort of models of...
I think my first experience, when I was 13 years old, I had the mumps. I guess the mumps have made a comeback now with the anti-vaxxer scandal. But I'm just old enough to have missed the mumps vaccine, so I actually got the mumps when I was 13. And I read, in a kind of fever, I read 1984. Before 1984. That's how old I am. And I just remember it was kind of a revelation that I think it was my first exposure to a certain style of writing, granted, maybe kind of British, but kind of clear, vivid, concrete, lucid prose. And I remember every once in a while just pausing and lingering over a sentence, and that may have been my first experience in this feverish delirium.
Well, it's C.S. Lewis always says that this was when he was still an atheist. He said for him, heaven would be recovering from obviously non-fatal illness and lying in bed and eating toast and basically reading philosophers. Yeah.
And Orwell himself, of course, was the author of one of the essays on writing that's handed out to every undergraduate, Politics in the English Language, a kind of a dubious essay, but he certainly paid attention to quality of prose.
Indeed. So as a student, you've mentioned a lot of people in your own discipline. Were there writers in other fields of inquiry that were...
Yeah, certainly analytic philosophy is another field. Are any of you philosophers? Philosophy is another field that tolerates, nay, encourages lively writing. Although it's a mixed bag, I should say. And you probably know there are two very different flavors of philosophy. There's continental philosophy of Heidegger and Foucault and Sartre, much of which is impenetrable, not a model of good prose. But then there's analytic philosophy, sometimes called Anglo-American philosophy, which has had a series of brilliant writers, maybe beginning with David Hume.
Yes.
But Bertrand Russell, A.J. Ayer, Gilbert Ryle, and contemporary examples include Dan Dennett, featured in the New Yorker this week, Ned Block, Jerry Fodor, who are often witty, irreverent, clear, and reading in philosophy also gave me both examples of good prose and the message you don't have to write badly to be a successful academic.
How do you convey this to students who do seem to feel this terrible responsibility of being a bad writer?
I hope by a bit of example, but also I will tell them. I will sometimes send a paper back and say, I'm sorry, I just don't understand it, and I just don't want to spend. I just don't want to spend an hour on your first paragraph. Forgive me. And it is often, Suzanne and I were talking about this before the session began, there is a funny kind of initiation into graduate school where I think some students get the impression that either that you ought to be a bad writer to be taken seriously, or not so much a deliberate effort to be a bad writer, but some bad habits. I think the foremost being that you're suddenly find yourself in this bubble. I don't know if it's this way in the humanities as much as in the sciences, where often in the sciences you're in a lab, which means you spend many of your waking hours with your advisor, your fellow grad students, a bunch of postdocs, a bunch of research assistants, and you all know the same concepts and jargon and classic studies and current studies. So you're now in this universe of this micro-universe of people who all are aware of the same background material. And that gives you the impression that it's kind of common knowledge, that everyone knows this stuff. And so there is and especially since you don't want to identify yourself as the one person who's new to all this, the kind of the newbie, the freshman, the tenderfoot. And so you write with a kind of knowingness where but you don't realize that you're reproducing a kind of private language and in-house lingo of like 5 people in the whole world, all of whom know exactly what you're talking about, but no one outside that little bubble of 5 people does. And I think that's one of the contributors. And I find that even, I'm in a department where there are other faculty who study similar topics, but sometimes I will get a paper in my own field, but written by grad students of another advisor, and I don't know what they're talking about. Just because they are so immersed in a small set of classic studies that they lose the imperative of just explaining things in concrete terms that anyone can appreciate. So sometimes even just expanding your imagined audience beyond your little bubble of advisors and fellow students. Sometimes even you don't have to imagine writing for the readership of the New Yorker or the New York Times. If you just imagine even writing for someone in your field but not in your subtopic, or someone even in an adjacent field, like a historian if you're not a historian, or a geologist if you're not a geologist, that expands your virtual audience so much that, that you're already in a better frame of mind.
That to me sounds almost like an ethics of academic writing.
Yeah.
And choosing to sort of counter tendencies toward parochialism in one's own thought, and to aim for accessibility but with complexity. At the end of this book, you actually give practical suggestions about what to do to improve writing. And this is, if what you just mentioned was an ethics of academic writing, this is sort of an ars poetica of it. You say, the principles you should worry about the most are not the ones that govern fused participles and possessive antecedents, but the ones that govern critical thinking and factual diligence. And then in the advice, you say, first look things up. So, and then second, be sure your arguments are sound. And third, don't confuse an anecdote or personal experience with the state of the world. That sounds like what you were just describing when people think their experience of the department is, yes. And then fourth, beware of false dichotomies. And finally, arguments should be based on reasons, not people. I'm very interested in the order of these. So all of this order follows from the broader assessment that the issue is critical thinking and factual diligence first, and actually know what you're talking about, and ideally not from Wikipedia and so on.
Well, Wikipedia is not bad.
Yeah. No, sometimes
Actually.
it's functional in sort of obvious ways. As we were talking a little bit before we started about the difference between the writing challenges faced by undergraduates and those faced by graduate students, and I sometimes encounter among graduate students the sense that somehow they've moved past the first look things up stage.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. With argumentation, I would say the number one issue that I come across in arguments is people don't want to write contestable arguments. The arguments where you can't see where the disagreement would happen. Yes.
You
Yeah.
kind of defensive writing?
Yeah.
Where you never say anything that is specific enough for anyone to
It
refute.
can't be pinned down.
But you always kind of hedge and fuzz up everything so that you can, dodge
Maneuverability.
any maneuverability.
Yes.
Yes, right.
Yeah. So who are you envisioning as the primary audience for first look things up? Just people in general, or yeah?
People in general,
Yeah.
including scholars. One humbling experience I had when I made the crossover from academic writing to writing for a broader audience is how much higher the standards are when you write it. Because you write an academic article,
Right.
so the editor sends it out to two referees, and they've got a million things to do,
Yeah.
and and they will flag anything that pertains to their own research and to issues that they care passionately about. But then when you write for a book that people actually buy in stores, you find that there's this world of expert amateurs.
Oh, yeah.
And you make like the slightest factual error anyway, and someone's going to call you on it. You're going to get a letter, and always with the same. I know this may seem like a trivial matter, but it calls into question. It calls into question how much factual diligence there was in the rest of the book. You get a couple letters like that, and you realize that you have to fact check an awful lot more than you typically do in an academic article. Ironically enough, and if you write for this is actually, I'm sadly getting a little less true, but when you write for the New York Times or the Atlantic, there is this profession called fact-checking, where someone typically with a bachelor's degree, right out of, or a PhD will just go over everything and say, document this claim, document that claim, and Wikipedia will not do. And you kind of realize how easy it is to get away with kind of bullshitting.
Yeah.
And also you realize that a lot of things that are that you're sure of are not so. That, I mean, as a cognitive psychologist, I should just know this about human memory. And your degree of confidence in your memory and the likelihood that that memory is accurate are very weakly correlated. So some things that you're sure of, you look it up and you say, geez, it didn't happen the way I remembered it. And actually, Wikipedia is, in all honesty, pretty good at fact-checking. You just can't rely on it exclusively.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's a good, even as a
pointer.
As a pointer, as a first check.
Yeah.
It's often surprising if you fact-check your own memories, at least for me, how many of them, you remember things that never happened, or at least they happened in a very different way. And so that's a good habit, that, ironically enough, I got into outside the realm of academic writing. But on the other hand, there are many people who, famous columnists, who will often say things that are patently false.
Sure.
And it wouldn't. All it would take is going to Wikipedia to show that it's false.
Well, it sounds as though this means that trust really comes first.
Yeah. Yes. Trust comes
Yes.
first. I mean, there's kind of a give and take. If your prose is well crafted, that helps earn trust.
Yeah.
But it ultimately has to be backed
Deference
up by
to fact.
Yeah. To fact.
Yes. Yeah.
And we won't. We'll just acknowledge that there exists currently an issue about factual diligence and accuracy in the public sphere, and we will say no more. But it is more relevant than ever.
I want to turn to some of the questions that students were kind enough to share. And one student prefaced her questions with the following remarks, which I'll just share with you because they're very nice. Thank you for your talk. I'm a big fan of your work and have read many of your books for fun over the years. You're a great writer and a brilliant thinker! ! Inspired by your work.
Thank you, whoever you are.
Yes, I have two questions. First, how do you motivate yourself to write and think on days when you feel distracted or find it hard to write? What advice could you give to PhD students who have to motivate themselves to sit down and write a dissertation but find themselves distracted?
No, it's a good question, and more relevant than ever that the tool that we use to compose writing, and it also is a tool that exposes you to infinite distractions.
Yeah.
And I can't lie and say that I'm immune to it. Oh, I'm so disciplined, I am so focused. Yeah, I'm not. But, and the ideal of just never being distracted by email is unrealizable, at least for me.
Yeah.
The challenge is just to limit it, to constrain it. So I will check my email first thing in the morning, and when I'm set aside a morning or a day to write, I will then turn it off. I'll close the program. Then I will, before lunch, I'll check it again. Sometimes if I just find myself with blocked, like I just don't know how to proceed, okay, I'll go back and check email. But just to limit it, not to. It's unrealistic to say that you can't check it at all. But one thing I do, and I am being completely sincere when I say this. I don't do Facebook. Maybe just I'm lucky enough not to be of that generation. I do tweet, but I try to avoid reading my Twitter feed simply because I know that it is an infinite loop. It's a black hole. So I don't do that. So that's a bit of discipline that I do exercise. And I will sometimes, before I start, indulge in a little bit of looking at interesting websites that are, just so that I remove the temptation. I think, was it Oscar Wilde said the best way to deal with temptation is to yield to it?
Yes.
In moderation, that is really true.
Yielding.
Strategic yielding. So if the problem is, if you start working and you think, oh boy, this is really interesting site, I wish I could read it, I wish I could read it, I wish I could read it. Just read the damn thing, get it out of your system, then close the browser and go back to your work. So don't try to be, Superwoman or Superman, completely oblivious to distractions, because then you're just always going to be a failure. Set a reasonable amount of indulging in this black hole, and then draw a line under it and say, okay, I've indulged myself. Now time to write, and I'm turning it off. And certainly do not enable any feature on your browser or screen that beeps at you every time an email or an update comes in. I mean, that for sure.
That way lies madness.
That way lies madness.
Yes.
Yeah. And just be aware that it is, however you deal with it, and also different, whatever. Because it's so personal, it just deals with your temptations, your motivations, your weaknesses, and so on. And everyone's is different. When you find something that works, stick with it as opposed to following anyone's advice. Kind of study yourself, learn what succeeds, what allows you to carve out blocks of time, and then go with that. Just kind of know yourself.
Well, that's very Hobbesian. You start by understanding yourself and your own passions.
And Socratic. And,
exactly.
And to some degree, Odyssean in terms of self-control. You tie yourself to the mast.
Right.
And you make it so that it's either impossible or at least very difficult to get distracted.
The Odyssean temptation, I think, is particularly relevant for graduate students because being of many minds and being polytropic, and then just how do you do that one thing?
Yeah.
Yes, and that relates to another student asked, how do you create calm and quiet in this increasingly noisy world?
First of all, just acknowledging that it is a problem to be solved is the first step. And sort of developing strategies to deal with it, which I think will be idiosyncratic to your situation. But things like staying home, at least for me, depending on how noisy your roommates are, whether you're more interrupted in your office here or your office at home. Strategically turning off distractions like social media and/or email. Just recognizing that this is something that you need to do, and developing your own strategies for doing it.
Well, that's very Odyssean. Put the wool in your ears.
Yes,
Yeah.
Exactly. Put the wool in your ears, tie yourself to the mast.
Yes, sensory limitation.
That is raw willpower.
Yes.
Is kind of overrated.
Yeah. Another question in a slightly different vein is, what are the most important differences between writing for an academic and a non-academic audience, or should there not be significant differences?
I think it's wise not to exaggerate the differences.
Writing's writing.
Writing is writing. There are some differences, inevitably, but reducing the difference between them, I think, is healthy. Even if you don't write an academic article in the same style as as an op-ed, but veering in that direction will make the academic prose better. Conversely, I got into writing for a broader audience when, as a result of improving the style of my journal articles, and in fact, it began when editor, I was at MIT at the time, and an editor at MIT Press, who read one of my articles in a journal, said, in effect, I'm paraphrasing, your writing doesn't suck as much as most academics. Have you ever thought of trying your hand at for a broader audience? And that's what gave me the idea.
Wow.
So it was kind of veering in that direction in the academic world. And I think that now, I've seen this in grad students. There are much more so than in my day, because of the blogosphere, there are more opportunities for grad students to try their hand at more accessible writing.
Absolutely.
Now, of course, you do have to, get your PhD, get a job, get tenure, and so it would be unwise to become a serious blogger at the expense of the publications in refereed journals. But the fact that those opportunities even exist means that you can kind of try your hand. It's all to the good, yeah.
Yes. Do academic writers always owe it to their readers to interest or entertain them? How does that demand fit with our belief that knowledge is worthwhile for its own sake?
Yeah, so it is a good question, because in writing for a general audience, there is I do put in the joke and the wisecrack and the anecdote and the allusion
Comic
and so
strip.
on. The comic strip, yes, especially in this book, a lot of comic strips. And there's different writers have different styles, but even those who do it, you realize that there's kind of an optimal amount, that you can overdo it, that if it becomes forced, your readers will know, oh, he's trying to be a comedian. And that doesn't work either. And of course, that is something that very much differs between academic and popular writing. You may not interrupt a journal article with a anecdote or a joke unless it is directly relevant to the point that you're making, which sometimes it is. So for example, if you're writing a linguistics article, there's sometimes when a joke actually illustrates a point about language. Or in psychology, it's one of the great things about being a psychologist, that sometimes what makes a joke funny illustrates a quirk of our psychology. And so when it's dead on, intellectually relevant, then it kind of serves the two purposes of entertaining and making a point. But in general, in academic writing, there is less tolerance for the entertaining for the sake of entertaining.
I've always loved the concept of wit, because it has multiple faces. And I mean, on the one hand, Aristotle says it's the highest form of intelligence, and then it's also just delightful.
It is, and again, there are many. Helen Sword, who wrote a lovely book called Stylish Academic Writing, I think, Harvard University Press. She's spoken here a couple of times. You might think this is almost like a bad, oh, that must be one of the world's thinnest books. She actually did a survey of 500 journal articles in a number of fields, and she found that about 15% of them, which is a lot considering how much verbiage we all churn out, could be classified as stylish. So it can be done. It varies from field to field. Some fields, the editors will not give you the license to be entertaining or stylish. Medical journals have a very rigid template as to how an article may be written. But but in a lot of fields, there is some license. I don't know what fields you. What are you from? Neuroscience? So. I mean, it depends on the journal, but not a whole lot of scope for wit, but some. English. That's complicated, right? Because in theory, as I understand it's called, a lot of the prose is god-awful, ironically enough. Pardon me? It likes to be seen as profound. It likes to be seen as profound. That's deadly. I mean, the thing is that if you're trying to look profound, that almost guarantees that you're not.
Yes.
That the profundity has to come from the content, not from the style.
Well, it has fund in it. Found.
Deep.
Yes,
Yes, that's what profound means.
Yeah,
it's not on the surface, right?
Yeah.
Other fields? I'm just curious. History. Okay. There's a lot of great writing, at least in popular history. I'm not sure about academic history.
Yeah, the journal articles can. There's a sort of genre, but journals tend to be more lenient and
Uh-huh.
Romance languages.
Okay.
It's kind of like English.
Yep. Oh,
Likes to be profound.
okay.
I'm in statistics.
Statistics.
Yeah.
There have been some witty statistics articles.
Jolly is hilarious.
Yes,
Yeah.
right. Harold Weiner, a lot of good,
The older ones.
and psychology, yes. Law. Okay. Well, actually, a lot of law articles are very well written, and there's some terrific legal writers, Cass Sunstein and Richard Epstein and Posner, Richard Posner. Yeah. Alan Dershowitz here at Harvard and others. Right.
Jewish studies?
Jewish studies. I don't know about the academic literature of Jewish studies. You'd think that there'd be rich scope for humor there, but I don't know if that's true.
Jewish studies?
Not unlike Jewish studies, not something you tend to associate with a lot of humor, but maybe.
Neuroscience, awesome.
Neuroscience.
Also Romance language and literature.
Okay.
Film theory?
Oh, the word theory was always very scary.
Film studies.
Film studies. Okay.
I'm a journalist, actually, not an academic.
You're a journalist.
Yeah.
Okay. So
I
different,
totally agree with
different,
what you said about writing.
different mores. Yeah, absolutely.
Islamic intellectual history.
Uh-huh. Doesn't necessarily sound like a barrel of monkeys, but maybe. Yeah. So I think there is some variation across fields. But anyway, Sword's research and my own reading confirms that there is scope in a lot of fields for stylish writing, including wit and a certain degree of playfulness.
I believe that. I recently had to talk with a lot of development people in the context of funding the center, and they said, "Oh, do you know of any good academic articles?" And I said, "Why, yes, I do." And I sent about 15 articles from different fields that I just draw intellectual sustenance, but also delight from. And there are these treasures out
Yeah.
there. It's
I mean,
not
you can't
all.
you can't just be
yeah.
a comedian for its own
No,
sake.
no.
But the one of the second most cited
Mm-hmm.
article in the history of psychology was George Miller's "The Magical Number 7 plus or minus 2: Some Limits on Our Capacity for Processing Information." And
That's
its first
a great
sentence
title.
isn't it?
Yeah.
And it itself has been a very successful
Yeah.
meme. It lies behind the common understanding that our short-term memory has a bottleneck of 7, as Miller called them, chunks. He introduced a technical term into the literature of the chunk. And the first sentence was, my problem is that I have been persecuted by an integer. That's how the article began in Psychological
Wow.
Review, and it was the second most cited, for many years, the most cited article. Now it's the second, the most cited article is by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, author of Thinking Fast and Slow and a Nobel Prize winner that some of you may have heard of.
Well, that's a beautiful first sentence, and it has some of the resonance of Gregor Samsa woke from uneasy dreams to find that he had been transformed into a cockroach.
No, a strong first sentence.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
something I learned from my other
Yes.
advisor, Steve Koslin,
Yeah.
who I think was not like a great stylist, but one habit that he instilled on me is don't begin a journal article with over the past decade an increasing amount of attention has been paid to the problem of X. Start with a interesting declarative statement.
That's right.
And I learned that from him really early on.
Well, I think that in ancient Greek understandings of theory, which we've talked a little bit about today, theory is a practice, and it begins with some sort of phenomenal observation of a fact in the world. And then you, as the theorist, you take a step back from it and you look at it. But it begins with an attention to a fact. And so,
Indeed,
yeah.
yes.
Yes, yeah.
So just to be concrete, because it's always good
Yeah.
to be concrete.
Yes.
I remember I was a second-year grad student. I was co-authoring my first paper with my advisor on the phenomenon of mental imagery, a topic in cognitive psychology. And I remember in the first draft, you just dashed off, the first sentence was, many creative people report seeing the solution to a problem in a mental image. And that was, it wasn't an original insight, but it's just a interesting observation about how the human mind works.
It's very clear.
It's very clear, but also here's a crucial distinction, and I think this is highly relevant to academic writing, that there are actually two different subjects in academic writing. There's what you're actually studying, Jewish history or Islamic history or the amygdala or the cingulate cortex or human working memory or the novels of George Eliot. Then there is the academic discipline that you belong to that keeps itself busy with writing journal articles and going to conferences. And there's a temptation to think that your subject matter is a bunch of professors who study something as opposed to the thing that they study.
Right.
And what made
Right.
that opening sentence, it's not a great example of prose, but I think the message that it conveyed to me is you're better off at least starting or keeping your focus on what it is in the world that you're in the business of studying, as opposed to how professors busy themselves and spend their time. There's a huge temptation to write this kind of ever-deepening loop of self-reference and academics thinking that they're studying other academics who are studying still other academics.
Right.
Now, that can keep you busy for a long time, but ultimately, we're all parasites on something in the world that we and other people presumably find interesting. And to just remember that distinction is, I think, another major lesson of good writing. Always remember that you're not studying other professors and grad students. You're studying something in the world. And so write about, now, to some extent, you can't do that completely. And that's one of the major differences between a popular article and an academic journal article. The academic journal article picks up from the work that's already been done, must be, to some extent, kind of self-referential. You're indicating how your contribution fits into the contribution of scholars who've come before you. But there's a temptation to overdo that, and that is to write about research as opposed to using the research to write about a phenomenon in the world.
That's very Aristotelian.
Is it?
Yes.
I'm an Aristotelian, I didn't even know it?
Yes.
It's like
So,
speaking prose all your life? Yeah.
So Aristotle, when he wants to talk about something like justice or courage, he starts by surveying what he understands to be the reputable opinions about whatever the thing is. And it's something that he learned from Socrates, that if you want to talk about something with your fellow human beings, ask them what they think about it. But he's assembling these reputable opinions for the purpose of seeing what's left for him to talk about. So it has a very practical aim. So he sorts through, 2 or 3 things that have been said, and then he sees, oh, well, what still hasn't been explained? What's left for me? And then moves forward from there. And so it's sort of a reminder of the inherently social nature of any kind of intellectual inquiry. Yeah.
I mean, it's unavoidable,
Yeah.
but it can also be a trap.
It can be.
yeah.
Dangerous trap.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I am going to turn the questions over to all of you, because I know there are questions that I haven't gotten to on this list. So, and also I'm sure there are questions that have been stimulated by our talk. So, go ahead. Questions? Yes.
So I'm a grad student in neuroscience, and I really enjoy studying the brain, but I also really enjoy communicating that science to the public. And there aren't, I think, many examples of people who do both on a really broad level. There are a lot of people who do science and they blog, but you don't see a whole lot of these kinds of popular articles by actual scientists in New York Times or New Yorker. And I've been trying to figure out if is this just like a really hard thing to balance? You're one of the few people who do these kinds of things, or is there just little taste for it, or?
Some of each. I advise young academics to not make it a major part of their careers until you get tenure. That's one of the great things about tenure. But you really do have to get tenure, you got to kind of throw yourself into it. But once you do, I think it is true that there are a lot of academics who just can't get out of the mindset of that social network that they're part of within their field. And it is kind of consuming. You can't really ignore what other people are doing, but it is a different mindset to return to the phenomena that got you interested in the subject in the first place. And there are only so many hours in a day, so if you have to maximize your grants and journal articles, I mean, unless you're more superhuman than I could ever hope to be, the academic side of it must take a hit. I've continued to publish in refereed journals and do all that kind of stuff, but it adds up to 100%, and you spend some time on one thing, you're spending less time on another, so you've got to decide that you want to make that sacrifice. And you have to set it as a goal in its own right. After I wrote my first popular book, The Language Instinct, I had a number of colleagues who thought, oh gee, well I need to send my kid to college, we need to renovate the kitchen, I think I'll write a popular book, get some cash. And the problem with that is, unless you take it as seriously as your scholarly or lab research, unless you think to yourself, I'm going to write a really high quality book, I'm going to throw myself into it, I'm going to set the highest standards for myself. If it's something you're just dashing off because you need the cash, you're just not going to be good at it and you're not going to get the cash, almost certainly. So you have to just throw yourself into it, and that's not easy to do when you have, when there are other things in your life. And part of the dedication of writing a truly good popular work is to concentrate on the writing style. I mean, to just think to yourself, what is it that does make for compelling prose? And that's got to occupy a certain amount of your waking consciousness.
It seems to me that transitioning from academic to more popular writing is not just a case of kind of transferring your ideas to the public, because there's always a limit as to what you can explain to people as an academic. So it's also about simplifying some of the ideas that you have. So I was wondering if you had thoughts about how to kind of explain the theoretical components of the work in a way that people can understand, and how much of that theory you have to, to what extent does that theory kind of come at the expense of the writing? I know the writers talk about this model of bricks and balloon, where you explain the kind of nice ideas or personal stories which are interspersed with kind of more theoretical components, where you're easing people into the harder stuff that forms part of your writing. So I was wondering how you kind of balance the two, and how you try and explain the deeper ideas.
Yeah. So my model is, my philosophy has always been not to use the jokes, the anecdotes, the cartoons, and so on as a kind of, adding sugar to the medicine. Like just, my readers, they'll never get the idea, and I don't want to bore them, and I want to sell some books. So I'll have some stuff they don't understand, and then I'll put in a Woody Allen joke to keep them going. That's definitely not the model. The idea really, at least in my aspiration, I don't know how often I succeed, is really to try to get the idea across in what I think of as an intellectually respectable way. And to do that, and so that the entertainment has to be in the service of that. And I'm lucky enough to be in a field, psychology and linguistics, where popular culture trades in those very phenomena. So it isn't just distracting people with a joke, it actually can be relevant. But I try to zero in on the concept in what I think of as the respectable level of understanding. And often the simplification is not in dumbing down the idea, but it is in temporarily putting aside a lot of the academic controversies and quibbling, and say, granted, I know my fellow academics are going to object to this because I'm presenting a theory for which I think the evidence is behind it, but not 100% of it, and there are reservations and there are caveats and so on. But I'm not trying to present the whole academic state of the art. I'm picking an idea that I'd be willing to defend to my colleagues as the best supported, and I want people to understand it. I think I partly got that from the first books of Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene, which I still think of as a model of popular science writing. He says in the preface, "As I am writing, I imagine my fellow academics having three reactions. One, yes, but on the other hand. Number two, but with the exception of. And three, ugh." So you have to realize that your fellow academics will have that reaction. But nonetheless, even though often in The Selfish Gene, a lot of the ideas go down very easily, but they survive careful rereading. And he takes a lot of care in choosing analogies and metaphors that are dead on. And that is my aspiration. That is not to dumb down the ideas, but to pick the perfect analogy, where the perfect analogy is not like a literary metaphor of something that reminds you of something, but rather something that actually conveys the essence of the idea. So I mean, it's just an idea that sort of pops into mind from The Selfish Gene, where in a chapter on evolutionary game theory, which is what is the optimal behavior in a social interaction in the context of adversaries also seeking the optimal behavior in anticipation of what you do, which is anticipation of what they do, which is an anticipation of what you do, and et cetera. That's kind of evolutionary game theory. There's a section in which he talks about a game called the War of Attrition. Again, that itself is an exact analogy. A war of attrition in history actually has many of the game theoretic properties of certain standoffs between animals. And in a war of attrition where there's a contested resource, two animals each try to outlast the other, incurring costs as they go, because if they're staring at each other, they're not getting food, they're not seeking mates, and so on. And each one looking for signs of a lack of resolve in the other, because as soon as one backs off, then the other can then claim the territory or the resource. And he says in those cases, because there is selection for the ability not to betray an intention to surrender, you have in the sense of something like the poker face will evolve. Now that is an exact analogy, because when you're playing a game of poker against an adversary, if you betray some knowledge of the strength of your hand, you compromise your own interests. And that is exactly true of two beavers facing each other off over a stretch of the river. And so the analogy in that case, the poker face from the realm of poker, is not just an ornament. It actually is the concept that he was trying to convey. And so I'm always in search of the familiar example that isn't just an ornament, it's not just entertainment, but it actually captures the phenomenon that I'm trying to explain.
So that requires, again, attentiveness to the world and
Yeah.
yeah.
But an attentiveness but again, not to, not just to entertain, but really to communicate, and not to compromise in the sense of, well, my readers are too stupid to really understand it. It's really giving and I think that's, by the way, another key prerequisite to writing for a wide audience is when you're generalizing beyond your narrow academic sphere, that doesn't mean writing for stupid people. And this is actually the first bit of advice I got from an editor when I made the transition. She said to me, a lot of academics, when they do decide to transition, they think, okay, I can relax now. I'm writing for truck drivers and chicken pluckers and so on. She said, wrong. Because if you do that, then you'll tend to talk down. You'll use baby talk. Instead, what you should think of as your college roommate who is as smart as you, but just happens not to know what you know.
also, because the poker face actually does the work of the idea, if you are a really good chicken plucker and you know sort of an action through and through, you may actually have better conceptual access to the metaphor. Yes.
It's quite possible. But,
Yeah, yeah.
But in general, chicken pluckers don't buy a lot of books. In reality, I know this is a very classist thing to say, but in general, that is a distinction that is important to keep in mind. And it's also true of writing even beyond your narrow circle of specialists. These are really smart people. However, they have not taken the classes you've taken. They don't know the jargon you know. Treat them as really, really smart, but as not knowing what you know.
If a theory has actual explanatory power, it's going to have some force for almost anyone who's interested.
That is right.
Yes.
That's exactly right. And so having that respect for your readers, but at the same time, and this is critical, and I have a whole chapter in The Sense of Style called The Curse of Knowledge, from a phenomenon that was named by an economist, but is widely known in psychology, which is that we all have a lot of difficulty in knowing what it's like not to know something that we know. Once you know it, the default tendency is to project that knowledge to everyone else. If I know it, then it's common knowledge. That is the major pitfall, cognitive pitfall to overcome in writing. And this is not just writing for a blog or a magazine, but even within your own field. You can often be surprised at what your readers don't know that you think everyone knows, even within your own field.
Well, and it's the challenge of teaching as well.
And it is
Yes.
absolutely
Yeah.
the challenge of teaching, yes.
Yes.
So you're all teaching fellows. It is the identical challenge.
Yes.
That is right.
Chenghua, you had a question?
Yeah.
So maybe you can share with us of your own experience between the thought processing or the idea developed and the actual writing. So
Yeah.
I used to separate this two. I have a very convoluted thinking process, ideas, it's like 3 steps deeper already, 5 steps deeper already, until it's perfect. So I want to output, right? And then I'm in this output mode, start to organize the language and like this, right? But then I also hear from other people, this two plays almost like 2 areas in the brain. You actually have this dialogue. A lot of people saying the writing actually helped them to shape their thinking. So recently I start to understand this a little bit, but you have much longer experience in writing, so I'm really wondering, like, what is actually the process for you? Like, do you actually benefit from the writing? You actually have revelations through the writing to shape your thinking? How this works?
Oh, absolutely. And it's because words are often much, thought and language are not the same thing, and words are often much more concrete and specific. Your thoughts can be multidimensional. They're analog. The precision of the thoughts and your own metacognitive appreciation of your thoughts can often be different. You often think that you understand something and you don't. And writing, which often forces you to make them that much more specific and concrete and to lay out the steps, can often expose your own lack of understanding, as does teaching. I mean,
That's
and
right.
I'm sure you've probably had the experience of teaching your classes, but I appreciated, this getting back to statistics, first time I had to teach the logic of a significance test to a group of students of statistical significance. As I was laying it out on the blackboard and talking, I suddenly realized what I'm about to say makes no sense. And I realized there's something I don't understand here. And I confess, I kind of bullshitted my way through the end of the lecture, but I was like soaked in sweat. It's like, oh my God, I'm about to say something that makes no sense. This
That's
can't.
so liberating. That's the
But
teaching's
it
working.
was liberating. It was liberating, and I went home and I tried to figure out what is it that I don't understand about p is less than 0.05, because I'm explaining p is less than 0.05, and what's coming out of my mouth makes no sense. And so I realized it was a revelation in that for the first time I really understood what a statistical significance test really was, which, by the way, the vast majority of social scientists who use statistics don't understand, and nor do often actually editors of journals. Some of you may know that statistics have become, and Xiaoli is not here to
Yes.
confirm this, are kind of a ritual that you often, unfortunately, are taught to go through just to prove that you're a serious scientist, but often what you think you're doing, you're not really doing. You're just going through, you're sacrificing a goat, you're bowing toward Jerusalem.
Local deities.
Yeah,
Yes.
local deities.
Obeisance.
But it was in teaching these freshmen that I realized, and teaching and writing will often do the same thing. You realize that you thought you understand something and you don't.
Well, Walter Ong says writing is a technology to restructure thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that thought is language,
No.
but it's often because writing is so crude compared to thoughts that you
Yeah.
realize how malformed your thoughts are.
The crudity helps.
The crudity helps. The
Yes.
crudity helps. Yeah, it's so true.
Yeah. More questions? Yes.
Mine is related to earlier questions, but a bit different, about writing books, but not popular books.
Yeah.
My advisor, after reading my prospectus, said, this topic is really interesting. You should just skip the dissertation stage and write the book. And he didn't mean a popular book, because I'm not there yet. I
Yeah.
need to write an academic book. And I didn't do that. I've written a dissertation, but partially because I had no idea what he meant.
Mm-hmm.
What the different, then now people talk about, turn your dissertation into a book. What would you say the main difference is between a thesis or?
So this, I think, differs a lot by field.
Yeah.
Remind me your field?
Romance languages and literature.
Romance languages.
It's like basically English,
Right.
but another language.
So, I suspect that this may even differ among academic communities within Romance languages and literature. So I don't know if there's a kind of a uniformity, or if it varies. I think it's actually good advice. If for no other reason than your dissertation is going to be read by 3 people. My advisor said your dissertation is going to be read by your committee and your mother. Is that what yours said?
That's what I've been thinking recently.
Yeah.
I get stressed out about it.
Yeah, so
Mom and these
why do it that way? I mean, what's the point? Write the book. Now again, I don't know exactly what the conventions are for dissertations, but often they consist of literature reviews well beyond the level of thoroughness and detail that anyone could possibly care about. And again, it varies by field, but it can often conform to certain standards of jargon and genuflecting to big names that you feel just is mandatory, various conventions and rituals that you can skip if you're writing a book.
It's worship the imperial gods.
Worship the imperial gods. I think I suspect I don't want to trade in invidious stereotypes, but of fields that I don't know much about. I kind of get the sense that you kind of have to say something about Foucault and something about Derrida and something about
Yes.
Butler and
Yes.
and
Yeah.
Althusser, and that's a really bad habit.
Felt to be obligatory.
Felt to be obligatory. I mean, I thought this was an unfair stereotype when I was.
Sad but true.
It's kind of sad.
Yes.
I mean, I realized this when I first came to Harvard from MIT, and at a faculty meeting, colleague after colleague got up and said, "As we have been enlightened by Foucault."
Well, that's
And I thought,
embarrassing.
it's kind of embarrassing.
Yeah,
I thought,
that's
geez,
sad.
you're acting out my worst stereotype. So I think there is probably something that is beneficial about thinking, at least even thinking of it as book, not dissertation. So thinking, I'm not writing for my 3 committee members and my mother. I'm at least writing for professors in my field and future graduate students who I have not yet met, sort of broadening your mental universe of your virtual audience always helps. Maybe that would be a way to, to think about the advantages.
More questions? Yeah.
What kind of
jumping off of that, and I might be unfair to ask you to comment on something so broad, but I'm interested to hear from someone who is conversant with the humanities, about the humanities and what their role is, because it is true that so much of the work that I see in English from other disciplines is about other academics rather than the subject matter. It's about the trends in the field and about the theory and trying to carve out these niches and explain what makes you different from everybody else. And so I've been trying to think, like, what is the point of writing in one genre versus the other? Like, why would you write an academic book or an article versus a popular book? Like, ideally, what should be the point of writing this? What should be the point of this knowledge or what we're doing? Should it be more of an academic enterprise? And a lot of it does just seem to be like just showing other people that they should take you seriously. Or should it be like, here's all these other people who aren't in our discipline and let's share with them what we have to offer that might like enrich their lives. And that seems like a different task than people who are in the sciences, where it's a little more obvious why you need this kind of loop going on among the scientists. So I've been thinking a lot about that because it's a very discouraging state of the field, it being entirely self-referential.
Right.
And so
I mean,
I'm
it is.
interested to hear what you think about that in relation to the humanities.
So there is I think there's a third alternative. So there's kind of popularizing ideas, knowledge. There is adding to this spiral, this loop of academics citing other academics. But then what's in between is adding to the world's knowledge, which is what academics are ostensibly doing. So returning to the phenomenon that got you interested in the first place, whether it's what is the phenomenon, or what's the?
I'm writing about Renaissance comedy.
Okay, Renaissance comedy. So there's Renaissance comedy, there's scholarship about Renaissance comedy. The scholarship is a means to the end for both popular audiences, but also your fellow scholars. How can I deepen people's understanding of Renaissance comedy? That's slightly different from how can I add to the literature or comment on previous people who studied Renaissance comedy. Now they're not disjoint, otherwise we'd really be wasting our time. But it's good just to remember that the scholarship is a means to an end. And the end is knowledge and insight about whatever excited you in the first place. So it's not, as a scholar, you're not a journalist. You hope to add to the world's knowledge about Renaissance comedy. But remember that that is what you're doing. And you're not just increasing the amount of scholarship. And you're not interested in other professors of Renaissance comedy. You're interested in Renaissance comedy using what previous professors have already contributed. So just keep the eye on the phenomenon. And which is also, I think it's just personally empowering just to remember that why we all pursued this line of work is there's something about the world that is exciting, important. We feel that we can add to understanding. And all of the scholarly stuff is a means to that end. But to retain that excitement about the phenomenon itself, not to lose sight of it in the thicket of commentary on commentary on commentary.
Well, one of the things that I often say to undergraduates in this capacity is I will take some sort of object and just sort of hold it up in front of me and say, what don't I know about this? Mm-hmm. Because something about it is not self-explanatory. A phenomenon in the world resists our understanding in some way, and getting to that point of resistance where the question is embedded in what we thought was obvious.
Yeah, and one of the most compelling things about a great lecturer, either a teacher or a popular lecturer, and again, this is a lot of overlap in writing, is it's just so exciting to be in the presence of someone who continues to be excited by his or her subject. And a lecture that is truly enjoyable is often one in which the lecturer just loses herself or himself in the subject. And even though they've been talking about it for 40 years, they still are amazed, flabbergasted, amused. They just retain that fascination with the phenomenon. And it can be anything. It can be snails, it can be Renaissance comedy, it can be 19th century novels. But just to have that enthusiasm.
Well, flabbergasted, amazed, and baffled. So
And,
that
well, and
you
baffled.
could,
Yeah,
yes.
no, there's no
Yeah.
shortage of bafflement.
Yeah.
Yeah. right.
Socrates says teaching is basically swimming while you're partially drowning and hoping for some unusual rescue.
So true.
Yes.
Yeah.
More questions? Yeah.
I was wondering how writing popularly has changed your perspective as a scholar, either scholarship, your identity as a scholar, or what have you, outside of teaching.
It has, above and beyond the actual prose that goes into the journal article, there are moments in which I get a new appreciation of the actual theory that I'm working in, not unlike the epiphany that I had while teaching something that I thought I understood, which I then realized I didn't understand. And sharing with other people what you find exciting is a way of kind of reminding yourself of what you don't know. And I have sometimes rethought my own technical subject matter based on my trying to explain it to a wider audience. And again, the wider audience is not truck drivers. The wider audience is lawyers and doctors and educators and people who read the New York Times. And but going to that level does make me rethink my own subject matter.
Dan?
Yes, so within my field in history, there's some variance in that if you work on something like, say, the origins of the Cold War, there are lots of other, there's a lot of literature on that, a lot of other people working on that subject and competing ideas, and there's a sort of lively discourse. In my realm of history, it tends to, historians tend to burrow so deeply into their own subjects that
Yes.
they're no longer in conversation with one another.
Yeah.
I, for instance, the documents I look at, no one has seen since they were boxed up and sent off to the National Archives 60 years ago. And so in a sense, I'm working on, what I'm doing is something that there aren't a lot of opportunities to collaborate, to generate ideas, to feel like I'm part of a community or a conversation. So what I'd like to add, has there ever been a situation in which you felt like you were sort of writing in isolation, that you maybe felt like a madman?
Yeah. There hasn't, in part because of the pros and cons of the internet. So and it is, you're right that it is important to be a part of a community, simply because none of us is enough of a genius to figure everything out and to trust our own reactions. And having your ideas challenged by someone else is just essential to understanding, together with just keeping you going, your enthusiasm up to know I'm not the only person who finds this interesting. So yeah, finding that community truly is important. What is your specialty?
Working on nuclear weapons and automation.
Automation in the sense of?
Computerization, telecommunication, command and control.
Oh, of the weapons itself. Like how easy is it to fire up an ICBM?
Yes.
And how easy would it be for some teenager to hack it and start World War III? Or a president, yes. Much scarier. Yes.
Essentially the origins of that anxiety about nuclear weapons potentially being uncontrollable or problematic.
That's fascinating and timely. I mean,
It is astonishing, and it's basically written like Thomas Pynchon is writing history.
huh. I mean, that's a really great topic. Really
Yeah.
important. Now, I'm sure you're not the only person who thinks about this, but
Surprisingly, most of the people have been political scientists.
true. So, are you going back to what, the years after 1945, like the kind of
Roughly 45 to 60. And that's
45? Yes, that's when the world got into this mess.
Right, and also for pragmatic reasons, there's a sort of veil of secrecy that just totally freezes the archives around 1958 to 1962.
I mean, post that that date, we are in a kind of a ignorance compared to prior to that date?
Yes, there's almost nothing available. 1965 is where essentially there's a total freeze on unclassified or declassified information. And,
Really? Okay.
some of that is bureaucratic in that it takes a lot of time and money to declassify something, and the government doesn't spend money to do that.
Well, I encourage you to pursue it. It's really, really important and fascinating. I mean, I don't know if you get into the technological aspect of it, or the strategic, or the political, or all?
Trying to layer them all together has been the approach, and that's the way that I've tried to build connections. Is that I know that it's a subject that people find interesting, but the way that I've tried to get into it, into the subject, is by examining sort of organizational and bureaucratic considerations, and that's where I'm sort of the madman in the wilderness.
I have to say, it's written as a book.
Oh,
It's the most astonishing reading.
Okay.
It basically, reads better than a good novel.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, I mean, it seems to me, I think one of the great things of contributions of the internet to scholarship is that you can find and create these virtual communities. Now, maybe your particular approach is so unique that this has been difficult, but
It's sort of reinventing our understanding of nuclear war.
I'm trying to find something interesting in what I imagine everyone else is considered too boring to bother looking at.
I mean, it's a sad commentary that people would find this boring, because this could be the end of the world. It behooves us to understand it, and I think anyone looking at the current situation would say we're kind of in a mad situation. That is, to have several thousand nuclear weapons aimed at each other, that doesn't make any. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm an amateur, so I'm saying things that
Well,
maybe.
he deals with Dr. Strangelove.
Well,
so
of course,
it's-
Dr. Strangelove,
yeah.
but also there's a lot of just the mere situation of having that number of weapons with that amount of destruction would seem to serve no real sensible military aim. So we got into this. It's not so easy to get out. How do we get in? And that I've often wondered this. That critical 15 years seems to be what changed the world. And so, more power to you for explaining it. It seems to me that you. So here, let me just throw out a suggestion then. I don't know how big the community of researchers is that studies this critical transition in the history of humankind, and it really is. But one of the things that you might pose as one of your own challenges is just to remind people of how interesting it is. That actually is part of the challenge of conveying academic research to a wider audience. Is you don't know how interesting this is. So my first goal is to prove to you that this is really interesting. That's something that you can forget being immersed in a field, being in graduate school. And that's often the first challenge. That William James had this wonderful expression, to make the familiar seem strange, to remind people that things that they take for granted really deserve an explanation, that when you step outside them and see it from a stranger's eyes, you realize there's some extraordinary phenomenon here that we don't think enough about. And reminding your readers, hey, you have not given much thought to the topic of my scholarship, but here's why you should. And I bet that is true of everyone in this room, but having just explained this particular example, this would be an example par excellence. That is, we could destroy life on Earth for no. It's not like a James Bond villain who at least enjoys being king of the world. It's like total irrationality that we should have gotten ourselves into this situation. So clearly there's some historical turning point, watershed, path dependency that we stuck ourselves in. How did we get here? Remind people, gee, have you ever thought of why we've got thousands of nuclear weapons aimed at each other? How did we get here? reminding people this is something you should be curious about, deadly curious, may be your first step. And then your findings, your analysis would be, after you've reminded people, you're more interested in this than you think you are. But it's a lesson that may be true for a lot of you, that you have to remind people of why they should be almost as interested, if not as interested, in your subject as you yourselves are.
Well, you have to check that it's as urgent for you as you want it to be for others too. And if the work isn't so exciting that you can't communicate it, are you working on what you should be working on?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's true. I mean, that could be a bracing reminder.
Yeah.
But if you have, I mean, that could be relevant to choosing your dissertation topic if you haven't already chosen one. Is this something for which you could generate enthusiasm among people who are not in your field?
I deliberately write in a bar, and people invariably end up asking you what it is you're doing, and then I explain it to them, and I just get so much amazing feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Often, I mean, again, that's the teaching, the writing, the explaining to the person in the bar,
Yeah.
forcing you to go back, and again, it's not dumbing down. It is, at least it shouldn't be. It is really returning to what you find fascinating and sharing that excitement, and often reminding yourself or testing yourself as to how well you yourself really understand it, which is often less well than you think.
Well, that's exactly right. More questions? Yeah.
I actually wanted to ask you about Twitter. Is it something, do you like tweeting? I know it can be a distraction for a lot of people, or do you kind of see it more as an obligation? I mean, as a journalist, obviously, it's very important for me to use Twitter, but I don't like doing it particularly. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that, because I know you have a good following there.
To my own shock, I started tweeting when my literary agent said you should, and not so much because he thought it would be good for my career as a writer, but I wrote an article for the New York Times on how I thought there was a lot of panic about digital media, where people were saying, oh, it's ruining the language and it's corrupting our ability to think. And I said, oh, that's all an exaggeration. And then he said, look, if you're going to say that, then you can't be completely detached from the world of digital media. You got to start tweeting. And so for me, I'm not saying this is a model for other people. It's kind of one way. I tweet. I try to avoid reading, following people on Twitter, even though I do. And when I do, I'm often rewarded. I often come across fascinating stuff I never would have otherwise. But I did the calculation that I could very easily spend the rest of my life clicking on things in Twitter. And it wouldn't be a waste of time. I'd really be learning stuff. Then I just have to think, if you do that, what is your life going to be like? It means that you're never going to write another book or even an article. So reality is you cannot do it, however tempting it is. I think and anyway, once I started tweeting, to my own shock, because I don't craft witticisms, or I don't share my little aperçus and observations. All of my tweets are basically links to interesting articles. And sometimes I'll have a little bit of a commentary. I think the reason that I think I have 250,000 followers, to my own surprise, is simply that I am in a situation where so many people send me interesting stuff from all walks of life, from nuclear war to fused participles, to the brain, to academic freedom, that I share it. So I think people find me a useful kind of portal to heterogeneous but interesting articles, kind of leveraging the fact that people send me all this interesting stuff.
That's an honor to be a conduit like that.
It kind of is.
Yeah.
And the fact that I have a following suggests that my own reading habits are of interest to people beyond just me. So.
Last question, Tom.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
The honor. This has to be good because I'm going to be remembered for this. Who do you turn to when you have half-baked theories that you want to think out before you write them? Who is the person that you trust with that vulnerable kind of whisper of an idea before you said it?
Certainly, I have the good fortune to be married to another writer and intellectual, Rebecca Goldstein, a novelist and philosopher, and someone with whom I share a lot of a worldview. So the basic assumptions are similar enough. So certainly Rebecca. Colleagues not so much colleagues that is the person down the hall from me at Harvard, because more and more with the internet, intellectual colleagues can be anywhere in the world. And I'll have some small number that are kind of start off on the same wavelength. So I'm not just kind of arguing from the get-go, where it's important to have your ideas challenged by people who disagree with you, but it's not a way to develop and deepen your ideas necessarily. You need to have someone who shares enough common ground that you can kind of explore the frontier. And so I have a certain number of people like that. I also show drafts of my book to my mother. And people, I mentioned this in the acknowledgments to the sense of style, that a lot of academics have the bad habit of using my mother as a kind of pointer to an unsophisticated reader. Which is unfair to mothers. Certainly would be unfair to my mother, who is very
My mother is
intelligent.
my best reader.
Yeah, my best reader, because she's really, really smart. She happened not to be an academic, but she's kind of the person I want to reach. And I'm not dumbing down when I show it to her, but I am writing for someone who just doesn't do for a living what I do for a living. And that's a kind of an ideal target. It can be a roommate, can be a sibling.
It could be me. I get both my parents on 2 lines, and they both give me opinions at the same time. So,
Okay.
Yeah. Well, this was just so amazing and so wonderful. So just thank you so much. It was
My pleasure.
illuminating.
Thanks to all of you for coming.
I'm thrilled that you came. I hope you'll come back sometime.
Have me back. I'll come back.
Excellent. Thank you.
Happy to. Thanks very much.